The history of Scandinavia is the history of the region of Northern Europe, comprising Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Finland and Iceland are at times considered part of Scandinavia. Prehistoric Age. Little evidence remains in Scandinavia of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age, except limited numbers of tools created from stone, bronze, and iron, some jewelry and ornaments, and stone burial cairns. One important collection that exists, however, is a widespread and rich collection of stone drawings known as petroglyphs. Stone Age Upper Paleolithic. As the ice receded, reindeer grazed on the flat lands of Denmark and southernmost Sweden. This was the land of the Arensberg culture, tribes who hunted over vast territories and lived in lavis on the tundra. There was little forest in this region except for Arctic white birch and rowan, but the taiga slowly appeared. Mesolithic. In the 7th millennium BC, when the reindeer and the hunters had moved for northern Scandinavia, forests had been established in the land. The Maglemosian culture lived in Denmark and southern Sweden. To the north, in Norway and most of southern Sweden, lived the Fosna-Hensbacker culture, who lived mostly along the edge of the forest. The northern hunter-gatherers followed the herds and the salmon runs, moving south during the winters, moving north again during the summers. These early peoples followed cultural traditions similar to those practiced throughout other regions in the far north areas, including modern Finland, Russia, and across the Bering Strait into the northernmost strip of North America. During the 6th millennium BC, southern Scandinavia was covered in temperate broadleaf and mixed forests. Fauna included aurochs, wizened moose, and red deer. The Kongomo's culture was dominant in this time period. They hunted seals and fished in the rich waters. North of the Kongomo's people lived other hunter-gatherers in most of southern Norway and Sweden, called the Nostvanli-Hult cultures, descendants of the Fosna and Hensbacker cultures. Near the end of the 6th millennium BC, the Kongomo's culture was replaced by the Ertebol culture in the south. Neolithic. During the 5th millennium BC, the Ertebol people learned pottery from neighboring tribes in the south, who had begun to cultivate the land and keep animals. They too started to cultivate the land, and by 3000 BC they became part of the megalithic Funnelbeaker culture. During the 4th millennium BC, these Funnelbeaker tribes expanded into Sweden up to Uppland. The Nostvanli-Hult tribes learned new technology from the advancing farmers and became the pitted ware cultures towards the end of the 4th millennium BC. These pitted ware tribes halted the advance of the farmers and pushed them south into southwestern Sweden. But some say that the farmers were not killed or chased away, but that they voluntarily joined the pitted ware culture and became part of them. At least one settlement appears to be mixed, the Alvestra pile dwelling. It is not known what language these early Scandinavians spoke, but towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC, they were overrun by new tribes who many scholars think spoke Proto-Indo-European, the battle axe culture. This new people advanced up to Uppland and the Oslofjord, and they probably provided the language that was the ancestor of the modern Scandinavian languages. They were cattle herders, and with them most of southern Scandinavia entered the Neolithic, Nordic Bronze Age. Even though Scandinavians joined the European Bronze Age cultures fairly late through trade, Scandinavian sites present rich and well-preserved objects made of wool, wood, and imported Central European bronze and gold. During this period, Scandinavia gave rise to the first known advanced civilization in this area following the Nordic Stone Age. The Scandinavians adopted many Central European and Mediterranean symbols at the same time that they created new styles and objects. Mycenae and Greece, the Villanovan culture, Phoenicia and ancient Egypt have all been identified as possible sources of influence in Scandinavian artwork from this period. The foreign influence is believed to originate with amber trade. and amber found in Mycenaean engraves from this period originates from the Baltic Sea. Several petroglyphs depict ships, and the large stone formations known as stone ships indicate that shipping played an important role in the culture. Several petroglyphs depict ships which could possibly be Mediterranean. For this period there are many mounds and fields of petroglyphs, but the signification is long since lost. There are also numerous artifacts of bronze and gold. The rather crude appearance of the petroglyphs compared to the bronze works have given rise to the theory that they were produced by different cultures or different social groups. No written language existed in the Nordic countries during the Bronze Age. The Nordic Bronze Age was characterized by a warm climate, which permitted a relatively dense population, but it ended with a climate change consisting of deteriorating, wetter and colder climate, and it seems very likely that the climate pushed the Germanic tribes southwards into continental Europe. During this time there was Scandinavian influence in Eastern Europe. 1,000 years later, the numerous East Germanic tribes that claimed Scandinavian origins, as did the Lombards, rendered Scandinavia the name womb of nations in Jordan's Getica. Pre-Roman Iron Age. The Nordic Bronze Age ended with a deteriorating, colder and wetter climate. This period is known for being poor in archaeological finds. This is also the period when the Germanic tribes became known to the Mediterranean world and the Romans. In 113–101 BC, two Germanic tribes originating from Jutland, in modern-day Denmark, attacked the Roman Republic in what is today known as the Cimbrian War. These two tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutons, initially inflicted the heaviest losses that Rome had suffered since the Second Punic War. The Cimbri and the Teutons were eventually defeated by the Roman legions. Initially iron was valuable and was used for decoration. The oldest objects were needles, but swords and sickles are found as well. Bronze continued to be used during the whole period but was mostly used for decoration. The traditions were a continuity from the Nordic Bronze Age, but there were strong influences from the Hallstatt culture in Central Europe. They continued with the Urnfield culture tradition of burning corpses and placing the remains in urns. During the last centuries, influences from the Central European Latin culture spread to Scandinavia from northwestern Germany, and there are finds from this period from all the provinces of southern Scandinavia. For this time archaeologists have found swords, shield bosses, spearheads, scissors, sickles, pincers, knives, needles, buckles, kettles, etc. Bronze continued to be used for torques and kettles, the style of which were a continuity from the Bronze Age. One of the most prominent finds is the Dagbjerg wagon from Jutland, a four-wheeled wagon of wood with bronze parts. Roman Iron Age. While many Germanic tribes sustained continued contact with the culture and military presence of the Roman Empire, much of Scandinavia existed on the most extreme periphery of the Latin world. With the exception of the passing references to the Swedes and the Geats, much of Scandinavia remained unrecorded by Roman authors. In Scandinavia, there was a great import of goods, such as coins, vessels, bronze images, glass beakers, enameled buckles, weapons, etc. Moreover, the style of metal objects and clay vessels was markedly Roman. For the first time appear objects such as shears and bournes. There are also many bog bodies from this time in Denmark, Schleswig and southern Sweden. Together with the bodies, there are weapons, household wares and clothes of wool. Great ships made for rowing have been found from the 4th century in Nydam Moss in Schleswig. Many were buried without burning, but the burning tradition later regained its popularity. Through the 5th century and 6th century, gold and silver became more common. Much of this can be attributed to the ransacking of the Roman Empire by Germanic tribes, from which many Scandinavians returned with gold and silver. Germanic Iron Age. The period succeeding the fall of the Roman Empire is known as the Germanic Iron Age, and it is divided into the early Germanic Iron and the late Germanic Iron Age, which in Sweden is known as the Vendel Age, with rich burials in the basin of Lake Mälaren. The early Germanic Iron Age is the period when the Danes appear in history, and according to Jordanus, they were an offshoot of the Swedes who had replaced the Heralds. During the fall of the Roman Empire, there was an abundance of gold that flowed into Scandinavia, and there are excellent works in gold from this period. Gold was used to make scabbard mountings and brachiates, notable examples of the golden horns of Gallius. After the Roman Empire had disappeared, gold became scarce and Scandinavians began to make objects of gilded bronze, with decorations of interlacing animals in Scandinavian style. The early Germanic Iron Age decorations show animals that are rather faithful anatomically, but in the late Germanic Iron Age they evolve into intricate shapes with interlacing and interwoven limbs that are well known from the Viking Age. Kvenland, known as Kvenland, Kvenland and similar terms in medieval sources, is an ancient name for an area in Scandinavia and Fennoscandia. A contemporary reference to Kvenland is provided in an Old English account written in the 9th century. It utilized the information provided by the Norwegian adventurer and traveler named Other. Kvenland, in that or nearly that spelling, is also known from Nordic sources, primarily Icelandic, but also one which was possibly written in the modern-day area of Norway. All the remaining Nordic sources date to the 12th and 13th centuries, but some of them, in part, are believed to be rewrites of older texts. Other references and possible references to Kvenland by other names or spellings are discussed in the main article of Kvenland. Viking Age. During the Viking Age, the Vikings raided, colonized and explored large parts of Europe, the Middle East, northern Africa, as far west as Newfoundland. The beginning of the Viking Age is commonly given as 793, when Vikings pillaged the important British island monastery of Lindisfarne, and its end is marked by the unsuccessful invasion of England attempted by Harold Hardrada in 1066 and the Norman conquest. Age of settlement. The Age of settlement began around 800 AD. The Vikings invaded and eventually settled in Scotland, England, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Ireland, Livonia, Normandy, the Shetland Islands, Sicily, Rus and Vinland, on what is now known as the island of Newfoundland. Swedish settlers were mostly present in Rus, Livonia, and other eastern regions, while the Norwegians and the Danish were primarily concentrated in Western and Northern Europe. These eastern traveling Scandinavian migrants were eventually known as Varangians, and according to the oldest Slavic sources, these Varangians founded Kiev and Rus, the major East European state prior to the Mongol invasions. The Western-led warriors, eventually known as Vikings, left great cultural marks on regions such as French Normandy, England, and Ireland, where the city of Dublin was founded by Viking invaders. Iceland first became colonized in the late 9th century. Christianization. Viking religious beliefs were heavily connected to Norse mythology. Vikings placed heavy emphasis on battle, honor and focused on the idea of Valhalla, a mythical home with the gods for fallen warriors. Christianity in Scandinavia came later than most parts of Europe. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth Christianized the country around 980. The process of Christianization began in Norway during the reigns of Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf II Haraldsson. Olaf and Olaf II had been baptized voluntarily outside of Norway. Olaf II managed to bring English clergy to his country. Norway's conversion from the Norse religion to Christianity was mostly the result of English missionaries. As a result of the adoption of Christianity by the monarchy and eventually the entirety of the country, Traditional shamanistic practices were marginalized and eventually persecuted. Vulvas, practitioners of side, a Scandinavian pre-Christian tradition, were executed or exiled under newly Christianized governments in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Icelandic Commonwealth adopted Christianity in 1000 AD, after pressure from Norway. The Gothi chieftain Thorgeir Josvetning Gothi was instrumental in bringing this about. Sweden required a little more time to transition to Christianity, with indigenous religious practices commonly held in localized communities well until the end of the 11th century. A brief Swedish civil war ensued in 1066, primarily reflecting the divisions between practitioners of indigenous religions and advocates of Christianity. By the mid-12th century, the Christian faction appeared to have triumphed. The once resistant centre of Uppsala became the seat of the Swedish archbishop in 1164. The Christianization of Scandinavia occurred nearly simultaneously with the end of the Viking era. The adoption of Christianity is believed to have aided in the absorption of Viking communities into the greater religious and cultural framework of the European continent. 1100 to 1600. Union. The Kalmar Union was a series of personal unions that united the three kingdoms of Denmark, Norway and Sweden under a single monarch. The countries had given up their sovereignty but not their independence, and diverging interests gave rise to a conflict that would hamper it from the 1430s until its final dissolution in 1523. The Kalmar War in 1611 to 1613 was the last serious attempt by a Danish king to recreate the Kalmar Union by force. However, the Kalmar War ended with a minor Danish victory and not the total defeat of the Swedes. No more Danish attempts would be made to recreate the Kalmar Union following this war. Reformation. The Protestant Reformation came to Scandinavia in the 1530s, and Scandinavia soon became one of the heartlands of Lutheranism. Catholicism almost completely vanished in Scandinavia, except for a small population in Denmark. 17th century. 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was a conflict fought between the years 1618 and 1648, principally in the Central European territory of the Holy Roman Empire but also involving most of the major continental powers. Although it was from its outset a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, the self-preservation of the Habsburg dynasty was also a central motive. The Danes and then Swedes intervened at various points to protect their interests. The Danish intervention began when Christian IV, the King of Denmark Norway, himself a Lutheran, helped the German Protestants by leading an army against the Holy Roman Empire. Fearing that Denmark's sovereignty as a Protestant nation was being threatened, the period began in 1625 and lasted till 1629. Christian IV had profited greatly from his policies in northern Germany as an administrator. Christian IV had done remarkably well, obtaining for his kingdom a level of stability and wealth that was virtually unmatched elsewhere in Europe, paid for by the Öresund toll and extensive war reparations from Sweden. It also helped that the French regent Cardinal Richelieu was willing to pay for a Danish incursion into Germany. Christian IV invaded at the head of a mercenary army of 20,000 men, but the Danish forces were severely beaten, and Christian IV had to sign an ignominious defeat, the first in a series of military setbacks to weaken his kingdom. The Swedish intervention began in 1630 and lasted until 1635. Some within Ferdinand II's court believed that Wallenstein wanted to take control of the German princes and thus gain influence over the emperor. Ferdinand II dismissed Wallenstein in 1630. He later recalled him after Gustavus Adolphus attacked the empire and prevailed in a number of significant battles. Gustavus Adolphus, like Christian IV before him, came to aid the German Lutherans to forestall Catholic aggression against the homeland and to obtain economic influence in the German states around the Baltic Sea. Also like Christian IV, Gustavus Adolphus was subsidized by Richelieu, the chief minister of King Louis XIII of France, and by the Dutch. From 1630 to 1634, they drove the Catholic forces back and regained much of the occupied Protestant lands. Rise of Sweden and the Swedish Empire. The Swedish power began under the rule of Charles IX. During the Ingrian War, Sweden expanded its territories eastward. Several other wars with Poland, Denmark, Norway, and German countries enabled further Swedish expansion, although there were some setbacks such as the Kalmar War. Sweden began consolidating its empire. Several other wars followed soon after, including the Northern Wars and the Scandinavian War. Denmark suffered many defeats during this period. Finally, under the rule of Charles XI, the empire was consolidated under a semi-absolute monarchy. 18th century. Great Northern War. The Great Northern War was fought between a coalition of Russia, Denmark, Norway and Saxony, Poland on one side and Sweden on the other side from 1700 to 1721. It started by a coordinated attack on Sweden by the coalition in 1700 and ended 1721 with the conclusion of the Treaty of Nystad and the Stockholm Treaties. As a result of the war, Russia supplanted Sweden as the dominant power on the Baltic Sea and became a major player in European politics. Colonialism. Both Sweden and Denmark, Norway maintained a number of colonies outside Scandinavia starting in the 17th century lasting until the 20th century. Greenland, Iceland and the Faroe Islands in the North Atlantic were Norwegian dependencies that were incorporated into the United Kingdom of Denmark. Norway. In the Caribbean, Denmark started a colony on St. Thomas in 1671, St. John in 1718, and purchased St. Croix from France in 1733. Denmark also maintained colonies in India, Tranquebar and Frederiksnagor. The Danish East India Company operated out of Tranquebar. Sweden also chartered a Swedish East India Company. During its heyday, the Danish and Swedish East India Companies imported more tea than the British East India Company, and smuggled 90% of it into Britain where it could be sold at a huge profit. Both East India Companies folded over the course of the Napoleonic Wars. Sweden had the short-lived colony New Sweden in Delaware in North America during the 1630s and later acquired the islands of St. Bartholomew and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean.